Unit 5, Passion Week, a summary of the events. Let's ask this question. What events make up what we call Passion Week? So the term passion means suffering, and we are speaking of the last week of Jesus' life on earth. So he came down from heaven to earth, grew up, lived a perfect sinless life, but all of it was leading toward these 7 days, this week where he was going to sacrifice his life for the sins of all humanity and offer forgiveness before a holy God. So before we look at kind of the significance of that, let's take a look at the days themselves. So let's look at a timeline of Passion Week, Jesus' final days on earth. So as we kind of put the days down here on the side, we want to remember one important thing, that the Passion Week took place during a very important time of the year called Passover. So at Passover season, everybody would converge upon Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover that we talked about in part 1, when God passed over his children and can preserve them in Egypt. And so this celebration became a yearly tradition in Jerusalem, and people from all over Israel would come. And so Jerusalem was packed during the Passover season. And so as we go through this week, one of the first things that we see is Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So he spends the night in a neighboring town called Bethany, and you can see the scriptures kind of down there at the bottom that talk about these events. But this was on the Sunday, so he comes into Jerusalem riding on a colt. We covered this previously. And that's when he makes his triumphal entry. So he's in Jerusalem during Passion Week on that Sunday. On the next day, that's when he returns and he cleans the temple a second time. And we see Jesus, we see the leaders, they confront Jesus, and this is when the plot to kill him really intensifies after he goes into the temple and cleans it a second time. And all of these, again, are there down there in the scriptures below. So that happens on Monday. The following day is when Judas begins to arrange to betray Jesus. And this is when the soldiers promise to pay him the 30 pieces of silver for information on how to capture Jesus. And he does that. He gives that to him. Then on Wednesday, we assume, and we don't have a direct record of this, but on this Wednesday, this is where we assume that Jesus is now going to begin the preparations for his final Passover meal with the disciples. But it's also where we believe that the Sanhedrin prepares to arrest Jesus. So they have now worked with Judas. They have information on where he's going to be and when he's going to be there. And this is Jesus' last night in the town of Bethany. So he goes back, stays in Bethany on Wednesday night, we assume, again, and then returns on Thursday. And that's really where the main events of Passion Week take place. So we assume that this preparation stuff happens on Wednesday, but now we get to Thursday, and this is where it really starts to ramp up. So on Thursday, we know that Peter and John go ahead to prepare Passover. Jesus sends them to do that. Jesus has his final Passover supper with the disciples inside Jerusalem during Passover week. And this is, of course, also the event we read about in John 15, where Jesus is with his disciples, and this is where we see Judas leave, and the events of the betrayal and the arrest begin. So Judas betrays Jesus, he leaves, he goes and gets the Roman soldiers. Jesus and the disciples go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is where he prays, and they fall asleep, and Jesus begins to, it says, sweat great drops of blood, and then he's in the garden. First, we see his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is where Peter attempts to kind of save Jesus, and he cuts off the ear of Malchus, the soldier. Jesus heals him, and they arrest Jesus, and now they start to take him through a number of trials. The first one is before Annas, who is the high priest. So he goes there and has his first trial. This is, again, on Thursday, so now we're starting to go into the late night hours. And, of course, late night trials were illegal. But Jesus is now going to be taken around Jerusalem during the night. And the first place he goes is before Annas. We can see right down there, Matthew 26 and so on. So that's his first trial. The second trial is before the Sanhedrin. And so now we have another illegal trial. This is middle of the night, Friday morning, and this is when the mockery and the assaults begin. And so they start to beat him, they start to mock him, saying, "You're the king of the Jews," and they start to abuse Jesus badly. But then they take him to a third trial this night, again, being held at dawn. So this one, we don't know exactly when, but this is when we see the very next morning. So now the momentum is building. Jesus has now been awake all night. He probably hasn't eaten, and he's been dragged through the city and mistreated and accused and abused in every possible way. So we have this third trial held at dawn. This is before everybody, the chief priests, the elders, the scribes. They condemn Jesus for blasphemy. And so then from there, they take him to right before Pontius Pilate. So he was the Roman governor. So he now interrogates Jesus, and this is where Jesus is totally silent. And Pilate releases him back and says, I don't find any fault with this man. But he takes him then before Herod, because Jesus is under Herod's jurisdiction. And when he arrives at Herod, all Herod wants to see is a show. He's like, I've heard this guy can do miracles. Can do something for me. Jesus, of course, refuses. He's beaten further, and he is now sent back to Pontius Pilate. And so now it's about, they think, 9 a.m. or so. The crowd has gathered. There's a frenzy going on, and Pilate has to decide what to do. And so he scourges Jesus, hoping it will appease the crowds. Of course, it does not. And so he says, well, I'm going to release one. I'm going to release Barabbas, or I'm going to release Jesus. And they have said, no, crucify Jesus and release Barabbas, who is a known criminal. And of course, after that, Jesus has been tortured. He has been beaten. He is now heading to the cross. And so they make him carry the crossbeam from inside the city up outside the city, while being, again, kind of mocked and all of the stuff that we've seen in movies and such, but way worse than we could ever possibly imagine. But now he heads up. And again, all of this is from Thursday night into Friday during the daytime. So now it's Friday morning. Jesus arrives at Golgotha outside the city of Jerusalem sometime in the morning, and he is crucified, and he is nailed to a Roman cross, and he is up there for 6 hours, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And he makes 7 statements during this time, and then Jesus dies around 3 p.m. After that, he is taken off the cross. His body is buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea before sundown, which was the Sabbath. And then we can see how all of this is on Friday. So from Thursday night all the way through Friday at sundown is the great moments of suffering. Jesus' suffering is intensified. That was when he truly fulfills his mission. He dies before sundown on Friday, and on Saturday, the soldiers guard the tomb to prevent anyone from stealing the body of Jesus. Early Sunday morning, we see an earthquake. An angel of the Lord causes it. The stone rolls away, and when the women find the tomb, they find it empty. And this is, of course, the Sunday morning, the Easter Sunday morning. They go and find the tomb. They go to mourn, but there's no body. The rock is gone, and the body is gone. And so that is a brief summary of the events of the Passion Week. And so we know that Jesus has completed his mission. He's come from heaven to earth. He lived a perfect life. He died in our place. And now he is dead. And so his mission has been fulfilled, but he's also going to rise from the dead. And so before we get to that, though, we have to ask the question, as we look at Passion Week, what have his life and his death accomplished? Because we know that Jesus is going to rise victoriously from the dead. But before we get to that, we have to ask this question: what was accomplished through Jesus' life, through this Messiah coming, fulfilling the law, living a perfect life, and dying? What was accomplished? So that's what we're going to look at next. So in Unit 6, we're going to complete our look at Passion Week. Now that we've looked at the kind of the order of the events and what the events were, now we want to look at the significance of the events. So we're going to do that in Unit 6.